Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our monthly So Now You Know webinar, where we discuss an interesting legal topic in a bit more detail so that all you fine people out there can benefit. Today, our topic is the recent updates that the Film and Publications Board released in relation to their classification guidelines. But before we get there, a little bit more about legalese. Legalese is a creative legal practice which has redesigned legal services to suit creative, startup, and tech-based businesses by making them accessible, affordable, and understandable. Traditionally, lawyers are called upon to fix problems. Legalese looks at law differently, and we have a fresh approach to law and technology so that our legal solutions fit your business, your team, and your culture. A little bit more about me. My name is Kyle Freitag. I'm the head of commercial law, as well as the head of the gaming department at Legalese. That doesn't necessarily mean I whip everybody else's asses at Mortal Kombat, even though that is the case. But it does mean that I assist our gaming company clients with their legal needs, from licensing to publishing to engagement of their team members. At Legalese, we do our best to be a one-stop legal shop for our clients, and our gaming clients are no exception to that rule. So, what are we talking about today? All right, so today we'll be discussing the Film and Publication Board, which is known more colloquially as the FPB, which is what I'll be referring to it as throughout this presentation. So we'll be discussing the FPB in broad strokes, just so that everybody watching has a bit more insight and information as to who they are and what they do. I'll then introduce the guidelines that they created and what those guidelines are used for and contain. And then I'll wrap up with a discussion as to the recent updates to those guidelines, what they mean for those of you who work in the game and film industries. All right, so if we take a look at our slide, the Film and Publication Board, or as I said, the FPB, they classify films, games, and certain publications, and they have recently updated their guidelines. And as I said, today we're going to be discussing the impact that those games have, that those amendments have to the film and gaming industries. So let's get cracking then, eh? Who exactly are the FPB? All right, the Film and Publications Act 65 of 1996 provides for the establishment of the FPB. As I've said, they are responsible for the classification of films, games, and certain publications. No film or game may be distributed or exhibited in public unless it has been classified by the FPB. So they're quite an important body. Their powers are broad, and if you're going to be doing, if you're going to be distributing any sort of film, games, or certain publications, as we'll discuss in a later slide, you need to get your films or your games rated and classified by the FPB first. Right, so why do the FPB do what they do? They are mandated by the Films and Publication Act to regulate the creation, production, possession, and distribution of films, games, certain publications, and the internet. They do this by way of classification. This is done in order to provide consumer, to provide consumer advice to enable adults to make informed viewing, reading, and gaming choices, both for themselves and for the children in their care. It's also done to protect children from exposure to disturbing and harmful materials and from premature exposure to adult experiences. It is also done to make the use of children in and the exposure of children to pornography punishable, which I think we can all agree on. It's further done to criminalize the possession, production, and distribution of child pornography, and further to create offenses for non-compliance with the Act. All right, so how do they do what they do? So, in other words, how are films and games and publications classified? This is done mainly through the provision of age ratings, and it is done through certain consumer advisories. As I've alluded to, all films, games, and only certain publications that are distributed within the Republic of South Africa are required to be submitted to the FPB for classification. It does not apply to broadcast material and publications that fall within the realm of the responsibility of the Press Council, why I say only certain publications is because publications are only classified once a public complaint is received. So books, magazines, paintings, etc., only classified once the FPB receives a public complaint. As you may imagine, the sheer volume of the publications that they receive would be, you'd write something and then it would come out 5 years down the line, because they would have such a backlog if they had to review and rate all publications before those publications came out. So let's look at a few helpful definitions. The first definition that I'd like to discuss today is competitive intensity. This means the degree to which a player gets personally involved and the level of excitement created in the player. This is obviously mainly in relation to games, as they engage with the various game levels in order to gain incentives and rewards. This includes the compulsive nature of gaming that could lead to addiction. Another definition that I'd like to discuss is cumulative impact. This means the increase in quantity, degree, or force by successive additions of classifiable elements. Classifiable elements is something that we will discuss shortly, so you might not understand that term right now, but in a later slide we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. So it's force by successive additions of classifiable elements, the increase in the degree, intensity, or force of a single classifiable element, or the sum of the effect of a single classifiable element having reached its highest intensity, or the impact of the overall theme of the content. The last definition that I want to discuss here is moral harm. It may seem like an easy definition, but for the purposes of these classification guidelines, moral harm means desensitizing to the effects of violence, diminished empathy, encouraging a dehumanized view of others, suppressing pro-social attitudes, encouraging antisocial attitudes, reinforcing unhealthy fantasies, or eroding a sense of moral responsibility, retarding social and moral development in children, distorting a child's sense of right and wrong, and limiting a child's capacity to compassion. So these are obviously things that through the classification of content, the FPB tries to specifically avoid. They try to avoid, by somebody watching a piece of content that has been inappropriately rated, they are of the view that will cause what this definition of moral harm to the person that is exposed to that content. Right, so as I said, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the classifiable elements. And what does that mean? So in terms of the classification guidelines, a classifiable element is a specific consideration which may influence the age restriction or other classification of content if it is present, based on the impact that it has within a specific context. Context is very important in relation to the classification of games and films. Naturally, there are certain situations where the context of a certain scene or a certain stage or level in a game, for example, the context of that and the classifiable elements that are introduced in that context are very relevant to the determination of the age restriction for that piece of content. So what kinds of classifiable elements are taken into account by the FPB's classification committee when classifying a film, game, or publication? We've already discussed the first one, which is competitive intensity, on the definition slide a little bit earlier. But as a classifiable element, the level of competitive intensity of a game is taken into account alongside the rewards and incentives which are present in the gameplay and or the extent to which it is linked to in-game violence. Criminal techniques and instructional details of illegal or dangerous acts that may be life-threatening and detailed enough to be reenacted or self-instructional are treated as classifiable elements themselves. Their presence may require a higher age restriction, for example. This would apply to games like Grand Theft Auto, where criminal techniques taking place as part of the game are important aspects of it. Going to the next one, substance abuse, quite an easy one. This refers to the sustained or sporadic excessive use of substances, or any use or visual representation of illicit substances and the unlawful use of substances. Interestingly, the guidelines provide that regardless of the level of age restriction, the public must be alerted to the occurrence of substance abuse of a mild, moderate, strong, or very strong impact. So regardless of the fact that there may not be a specific visual representation of the use of an illicit substance, but even if there is an allusion to it, or it is an implied consideration, in those circumstances, the public must be alerted to it. So in those circumstances, the rating that is applied to this by to a substance abuse consideration by the FPB would at the very least, even if it's implied or not on screen, it is at the very least going to be brought to the public's attention. So the FPB will issue a rating and make it clear to the public that there is some aspects of substance abuse or drug use within the relevant piece of content. The next thing that we need to talk about is imitative acts and techniques. This is a classifiable element that determines age restrictions where there is a reasonable likelihood that such acts or techniques may be copied or imitated, especially by children. The next one is horror. What's interesting about horror is that the classifiable element simply says any occurrences of horror of a mild, moderate, strong, or very strong nature must be considered in the allocation of an appropriate age restriction. But what is horror? In the definition section of the guidelines, the term horror is defined as the use of frightening elements to scare or unsettle the audience. In my personal view, horror is one of the most subjective elements that is taken into account in the classification of content. What is frightening to one person is not necessarily frightening to another. Some people are deathly afraid of insects, for example, so much so that seeing them on screen unsettles them. Does that mean that documentaries on insects must be age restricted? Obviously not. That is, so it's quite a subjective consideration to be taken into account, and also context, as I mentioned earlier, is extremely important in that determination. The further classifiable elements that we are going to talk about today is language, and this alerts the viewers to the use of any sort of strong language in the piece of content. Nudity, that may seem a bit obvious at first glance, but the guidelines do draw a distinction between nudity in natural, non-sexual context, for example, breastfeeding, or in bona fide cultural traditions. And they draw a distinction between that and the undue exposure of intimate parts for non-natural or sexual content. Turning to prejudice, prejudice warns of occurrences or language that is based or prejudiced with regard to race, that is biased or prejudiced with regard to race, ethnicity, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, birth, or any sort of other identifiable characteristics. Sexual conduct and sexual violence indicate the presence of sexual conduct and or sexual violence respectively, and must be classified appropriately. Something that needs to be noted here is that the presence of consensual sexual conduct must be regarded as having a very strong or extreme impact, while sexual violence must be regarded as having a moderate, strong, or very strong impact only. This, it seems a bit strange at first glance, but when I was preparing this webinar, I realized that this is likely because it is difficult to show sexual violence without showing sexual conduct. So the presence of sexual conduct itself is defined as having a very strong or extreme impact, and that is then sort of crystallized or sort of bolstered by the presence of the sexual violence aspect. And lastly, another easy one is good old vanilla violence, which just warns of violent occurrences within the content. We then turn to a few classification categories. So these are categories that the Film and Publication Board puts their films into on the basis of context, the impact of the classifiable elements on the content itself, and its release format. All three of these requirements are considered, and content is rated in a category that should fulfill all the stated requirements. The film is then given an age restriction classification of A, PG, 7 to 9 PG, 10 to 12 PG, 13, 16, XX, 18, or X18. The film may be refused to be classified. So the FPB may refuse to classify a film, which means that it cannot then be broadcast or displayed legally or validly within South Africa. So they may refuse classification if it contains child pornography, propaganda for war, or it incites imminent violence, or if it advocates hatred based on any identifiable group characteristic, and that constitutes incitement to cause harm. Trailers for films and games are treated similarly. The classification of trailers must be equal to or lower than the films that they advertise, regardless of the release format. Turning to the classification of games, similarly to films, classification decisions must consider the context, impact, and release format of the content. However, where the two differ is that the online interactivity of the game must be considered as well. So this is the extent to which players can interact with each other within the game, or the extent that players can talk to or have an effect on the game of another person over the internet. An important aspect of these recent amendments is the strange submission of the FPB that there's no all ages age rating for games. So gone are the days of games that can be taken for granted as appropriate for children to play unsupervised. The FPB says Circus Charlie can only be played with your direct supervision. Games, therefore, may have the following age restriction classifications applied to them. As you'll notice, there's no all ages rating. PG, 7 to 9 PG, 10 to 12 PG, 13, 16, 18, XX, or X18. Games may naturally also be refused classification on similar considerations as I previously mentioned. So, what changed from the previous version of the guidelines to the present version of the guidelines? In my view, not all the changes that were brought about by the amendments are positive. Happily, the majority of them are, but there are some changes that were confusing and unnecessary. Just a caveat as well, that these are not the only amendments that were made to their guidelines. There were some less impactful, but still important amendments that either require webinars of their own because the content is just so broad or requires so much discussion, or that simply aren't relevant to the audience that we selected for today. Firstly, the positive changes. So the definition of domestic violence has been more inclusively amended to include economic abuse, intimidation, harassment, stalking, damage to property, etc., as well as more broadly defining what is considered to be a domestic relationship. This change, in my view, is positive as it assists in broadening what is deemed to be domestic violence for the purposes of the FPB Act, which will assist in the fight against gender-based violence, which is an extremely important and valuable movement. The definition of prohibited content has also been added. Although it's a net positive that the definition has been added, because it may help to define content at a later stage, I was unable to find anywhere in the guidelines other than the definition sections where that definition of prohibited content was used. So that's a bit strange, but in my view, having it in the definition section is a good first step, because at a later stage, prohibited content can then be brought through into the actual guidelines themselves, and this will simply make it a little bit easier for them to do that. A few more positive changes is that the definition of substance abuse has been extended to include real or simulated use or the possession of illicit substances, or detailed instructions in the use of prescribed drugs and content promoting or encouraging prescribed drug use. This is positive for obvious reasons. In the past, somebody might have been able to use the fact that real or simulated, that the simulated aspect of illicit substances might not apply to them, because potentially the you have a game where drug use is one of the aspects of the game, and that you could argue that it doesn't fall under these guidelines because it is simulated use. That is no longer possible, and the definitions of substance abuse has been extended to include that as well. An interesting inclusion, moving on, is the inclusion of low frequency noise, which is noise of a frequency of 100 to 150 hertz. It's not treated as a classifiable element determining age restrictions, but rather for appropriate consumer advice. These must be provided even in instances of low impact. You can understand that certain medical conditions, for example, epilepsy, might be triggered by noises of a certain frequency, whether that frequency is high or low. The FPB also does take into account screen flickering, for example, but that's been in the guidelines for a while, so it wasn't the change that I needed to discuss, but it's just an interesting side note for those watching. In the gaming world, the definition of the term game has been amended to include games which are accessed or played using the internet. This also speaks to the closure of a gap in the law, where before somebody could potentially argue that because their game is accessed via the internet, it need not be classified prior to distribution. That is no longer the case. It was a fairly spurious argument beforehand, but they have now closed that gap, and that argument is now will not be countenanced whatsoever. The last positive changes that I have to discuss for today is the definition of identifiable group characteristic has been defined to include a catch-all ground for the determination of discriminatory content. So those group characteristics that I mentioned earlier, like race or age or pregnancy, or any sort of those aspects that people might discriminate against another person on the basis of, they have now added a consideration into the definition of identifiable group characteristics, so that in the event that one of those set aspects of or set classes of or set characteristics of the groups that you would discriminate against, if one of those doesn't find application, but it is still a clearly discriminatory piece of content for whatever reason, there is now a mechanism for those pieces of content to be classified on the basis of an identifiable group characteristic that is yet to be defined. Finally, a positive change is that child pornography has been added into the classification of refused content, such that there can be no acceptable version of media containing child pornography. I think we can all agree on that one. Turning to a few less positive changes, and before I delve into this list, which is admittedly short, I want to make it clear that my viewpoint on the positivity or negativity of these amendments are subjective. They're opinion-based. So if you don't agree with them or you'd like to discuss them any further, please do get in touch with us and we can take it a little bit further. The main negative aspect and the issue that I take with the amendments that have been made to the guidelines is the removal of the all ages category for games. I alluded to it a little bit previously, but it does mean that according to the FPB, there's no circumstance where a child can play a game without adult supervision. In my view, and in consideration of the vast availability of more innocent games out there, not to mention the availability of educational games, this view is extremely short-sighted and extremely heavy-handed. The guidelines take a blanket black and white approach towards the all ages games that never seems to work out very well in our shades of gray world. A little bit less of an important change, but still one that to me shows, it's a little bit more symptomatic of the potential lack of care that was put into the amendments to these guidelines, is the classification of the parental guidance classifier. There are aspects to it that don't make sense to me. For example, within that classification, reference is made to implied, verbal, or actual low impact nudity or imitative acts or techniques. Personally, I'm uncertain as to how verbal nudity might occur, or how one may be subjected to implied bad language. I speak under correction. I haven't seen every piece of content that's out there, but verbal nudity it's a new one for me. I personally would like to see the information and research that the removal of the all ages rating for games was based on. There are many non-violent educational games out there that do not require parental supervision. I'm not suggesting by any means that children should not be given, that children should be given unfettered access to all software or games. And there are obviously going to be requirements that parents or guardians should assess the game prior to showing it to their children. But I fail to see the harm in age-appropriate educational games, and I disagree strongly that there are no all ages games. The nonsensical aspect of the PG classification that I referred to simply needs a more refined drafting eye, but it is, as I said, symptomatic of a larger problem. Right, so today I took you through a brief introduction to the Film and Publications Board. I've given you some context on how they classify films, games, and publications, and the factors that they take into account. We then rounded off with a discussion of the actual amendments that were made that became effective on the 1st of August 2022. And that is my webinar for today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise a hand. I'll give it a few minutes. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us. Please don't hesitate to let us know if you have any comments or concerns in relation to the discussion today. Here are our contact details. You can get in touch with us on any of the social media links that we have here, or you can get in touch with us via our website, www.legalese.co.za, or by emailing info@legalese.co.za. Right, I'll give it a few minutes for questions. I don't see any that have come through as yet, but I'll give it a few minutes and then we will then I'll wrap things up. Somebody has raised a question here that if games media review or create content around a game, do they have to get that content classified? So it's a very good question. If the media is going to be reviewing or creating content around a game, it is generally, as I said earlier, the province of the press board. The press board will then in the circumstances where that piece of media or that content has been there's a complaint that's leveled against it or something like that, then the press board will step in with their procedures. A little bit of a different sort of procedure in relation to the one that's followed by the FPB, because the press board obviously there's stuff like that they need to take into account, like the validity of what's being said, the truth, and the fact that the audiences are not being misled, that it's not fake news, etc. Those are things that are taken into account by the press board as opposed to the FPB. A very good question. Thank you very much, Chris. Another question: if a company sponsors an online tournament of a game with live stream on Twitch or YouTube, running product ads during this as well, does all this content have to be classified? It's a very good question. The content does not necessarily need to be classified, because you're not the you'd be very unlikely to be the person broadcasting it. If you're live streaming it, you'd be aggregating the live streams of other people. But it is a good question, and it's something that I might need to answer in a little bit more detail. So Chris, if you'd like to get in touch with us, we could do a small amount of research for you and have a look at answering that in a bit more detail, to the extent that I haven't been able to do so now. Any more questions, anybody? Somebody's raised a good question here. The requirement, does the requirement that no game there's no all ages rating for games, mean that South Africa we have to reclassify games with such a rating. It's unlikely. In my view, these classification guidelines or the amendments to the classification guidelines would not be what we as lawyers call retrospectively effective. I don't. So it comes into being, and it's only effective from a certain date going forward, not from a certain date going backwards and forward. So in my view, it would be unlikely that any of those games need to be reclassified. Of course, if those games are re-released for any reason, or as sometimes done, there is a game of the year version of that game that is released, then potentially in those circumstances that content will need to be reclassified. But again, it's another thing that we need to look into a little bit deeper. But I hope I've answered that question appropriately. And then a question that somebody's asked here: is it possible to get a copy of this presentation or view it somewhere offline? We would absolutely be making this webinar available on our YouTube channel, which it should be going up in the next couple of days. So you'll be able to view all our webinars and all our past webinars on our YouTube channel. I believe our YouTube channel is Lawyers of Legalese as well. All right, guys, it doesn't look like there are any more questions that are coming through. So I think we're going to wrap up so that everybody can get on with their Thursdays. Thank you very much. This has been a great discussion, and thank you for the robust questions that I received as well. But please do get in touch with us if there are any other aspects of these classification guidelines that are unclear, or anything that we can assist you with from a legal perspective. Thanks very much. Have a great